In all of World War II, few moments in the underwater war stunned Japan's naval leadership as completely as this one. A single American submarine just one crippled 5 Japanese destroyers in only 4 days, right outside one of their most important anchorages. This wasn't luck, it wasn't coincidence, and it certainly wasn't a reckless stunt gone right. The truth is far more uncomfortable. Through a string of decisions so aggressive they bordered on impossible, Commander Samuel Dealey shredded a critical piece of Japan's defensive screen, forcing their admirals to rethink an entire operation, an operation that collapsed spectacularly only days later in the Philippine Sea. But to understand how that could even happen, we have to start with the one principle every submarine commander accepted as gospel. You do not fight a destroyer, ever. Submarines were hunters of unarmed or lightly escorted cargo ships, slow, heavy, vulnerable targets that fed the enemy war machine. Destroyers were something else entirely. Fast, relentless predators built to kill submarines. They carried sonar that could rip through the ocean's silence and depth charges that could turn water pressure into a crushing weapon. If a submarine was detected by a destroyer, the expected sequence was almost ritualistic. Dive deep, shut everything down, stay silent, and pray the sonar operator makes a mistake. And history backed that fear. Between December 1941 and early 1944, Japanese destroyers managed to sink 14 U.S. submarines in direct combat. In that same span, the number of destroyers sunk by U.S. subs in a head-to-head fight was exactly 0. The numbers were brutal. A Japanese destroyer could race along at 35 knots. A submerged submarine on batteries could barely push 9. One was designed to chase. The other was designed to hide. That was the law of the underwater battlefield, until 1944, when one quiet, bespectacled commander decided that law no longer applied to him. Before Samuel Dealey became the commander who upended Japanese naval doctrine, he was an almost unremarkable figure on paper, quiet, reserved, a 1930 Naval Academy graduate who spoke softly and wore wire-rimmed glasses. But inside the submarine force, the men who had served with him knew better. Dealey had been shaped under the command of one of the most feared and respected skippers in the Pacific, Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton of the USS Wahoo. Serving as Morton's executive officer, Dealey absorbed every lesson the hard way. Morton believed in speed, audacity, and ruthless initiative, that hesitation was deadlier than any depth charge. Dealey had watched Morton make impossible shots, seize microscopic opportunities, and turn sheer aggression into a tactical edge. All of it left a mark. By 1944, Dealey finally had a command of his own. The Gato-class submarine USS Harder, operating out of Fremantle, Australia. And on his 5th war patrol, the quiet officer with the calm expression began applying Morton's teachings with a precision that stunned even the Pacific Fleet. On April 13, 1944, near Guam, Harder was stalking a Japanese convoy when its escort, the destroyer Ikazuchi, caught sight of her periscope feather. The destroyer reacted instantly, accelerating to ramming speed and bearing down on the submarine's position with the kind of murderous intent every submariner dreaded. Inside Harder's conning tower, the crew braced for the predictable order: dive. But that order never came. Instead, Dealey looked straight ahead and gave a command no sane submarine commander would utter, with a charging destroyer only moments away. Flank speed. Stand by the bow tubes. Harder surged forward, not away from danger, but directly at it. Dealey was attempting a maneuver so radical that many submarine officers of the era didn't even believe it was tactically viable. It was known as a down-the-throat shot. The idea was simple on paper and suicidal in practice. Fire straight into the oncoming destroyer, then crash dive, and hope the torpedoes hit before the enemy ship sliced your submarine in half. At a bare-knuckle range of 900 yards, Harder fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. 2 found their mark. The explosions ripped through Ikazuchi's midsection, tearing the destroyer apart. Within minutes, she broke in two and disappeared beneath the surface in a boiling cloud of smoke, flame, and debris. When Harder surfaced to confirm the kill, Dealey sent a report so terse and iconic it spread across the Pacific submarine force like wildfire. Expended 4 torpedoes and 1 destroyer. That single transmission electrified the silent service. Destroyers were supposed to be the hunters. Dealey had just turned one into prey. But in doing so, he had also drawn dangerous attention. In Tokyo, senior officers of the Imperial Japanese Navy were furious. And, in the Philippines, the man in charge of protecting Japan's remaining destroyers, Admiral Toyoda, was about to unleash a response none of Dealey's men could have predicted. Harder had killed her first wolf. Japan intended to make sure she would never kill another. Admiral Toyoda didn't take the loss of Ikazuchi lightly. Japan's destroyers were already disappearing at an alarming rate picked off by aircraft, submarines, mines, and fuel shortages. Every ship counted. And the idea that a single American submarine had dared attack a destroyer head-on and won was infuriating. Toyoda's problem was simple. Japan was running out of destroyers exactly when they needed them most. In early 1944, Toyoda was concentrating nearly everything he had for Operation Ago, the massive plan to lure the U.S. fleet into a decisive showdown in the Philippine Sea. To prepare, he gathered the full might of the Japanese mobile fleet at a remote anchorage called Tawi-Tawi in the Sulu archipelago. It was the largest Japanese naval buildup since Midway. 4 battleships, 9 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. They were waiting for the Americans to commit to the Marianas invasion. Once the U.S. fleet advanced, Toyoda intended to unleash his carriers in one final, all-or-nothing gamble. But Harder's audacity posed a new threat. If one submarine could kill a destroyer with a frontal shot, others might follow. And the U.S. commanders knew exactly how to exploit that fear. In Hawaii, American codebreakers at Station Hypo intercepted Japanese transmissions identifying Tawi-Tawi as the gathering point for the upcoming operation. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding the U.S. Pacific Submarine Force, immediately understood what this meant. Japan's carrier force was bottling itself up in a predictable location. All he needed was the right man to sneak into that kill zone undetected. And there was only one skipper who had recently proven he didn't fear destroyers. Commander Samuel Dealey aboard the USS Harder. Lockwood's orders to Dealey were short, sharp, and unusually direct. Penetrate the approaches to Tawi-Tawi, report fleet movements, and take any targets of opportunity. In other words, get inside the hornet's nest and sting anything that moves. For 9 tense days, Harder prowled the edges of Tawi-Tawi, slipping between destroyer patrol lines, diving beneath scouting aircraft, and tracking the rhythm of the fleet's movements. At any moment, a patrol plane could spot her wake. At any moment, a destroyer could catch a faint sonar contact and bring the hunt crashing down upon her. But Dealey remained invisible, an unseen knife hovering just outside Japan's most heavily guarded harbor. Then, on the night of June 6th, 1944, his luck ran out. At 0300, a Japanese float plane sweeping the dark sky caught a glint of Harder's periscope wake. It was barely a streak on the water, but it was enough. The pilot banked hard, fired a flare, and transmitted the alarm. Harder had been seen, and the hunters were already coming. Within the hour, 3 destroyers, Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanikaze, peeled away from the main fleet with a single, unambiguous directive: find the American submarine and kill her. Dealey brought Harder to periscope depth just as the horizon began to brighten. The sea was calm, the sky was colorless, and through his lens, he watched 3 Japanese destroyers charging toward him in formation, fast, sharp, and absolutely committed. He had killed 1 destroyer at point-blank range. Now 3 were coming to return the favor. The next decision he made would enter submarine legend. And for the second time in 2 months, Samuel Dealey refused to run. At dawn on June 6th, The Pacific was a glassy sheet of pale blue, the kind of quiet morning that made the violence of the night feel unreal. But through the periscope of USS Harder, that calm shattered instantly. 3 destroyers, Minazuki, Hayanami, and Tanakaze, were slicing through the water toward Dealey's position, their zigzag patterns growing sharper as they closed the distance. They weren't patrolling, they weren't escorting, they were hunting, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. Inside the conning tower, every man braced for Dealey to give the standard order to dive deep and hide. That was what any normal submarine commander would do. But Dealey wasn't any normal commander. He turned harder toward the lead destroyer, Minazuki. "Make ready the bow tubes," he said, calm, steady, as if ordering coffee. The range tightened rapidly. "Beer, Beshu's yards. Beer, Ikkyu's yards." The sonar pings from Minazuki were now slamming into Harder's hull in rapid, urgent bursts, sharp metallic hammer blows echoing through steel. Minazuki had them, and she was charging in for the kill. At 750 yards, Dealey could see the destroyer's bow wave foaming white, a knife tip of water slicing toward them. The collision clock was ticking. 90 seconds, 80, 70. Dealey didn't flinch. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. 3 Mark 18 electric torpedoes surged from the tubes, silently racing toward the enemy. At the same moment, Dealey ordered, "Take her down, 300 feet, all ahead full." Harder lurched downward at a brutal angle, the deck tilting like a falling elevator. Men grabbed pipes, valves, anything bolted to the floor as the submarine clawed for depth. 40 seconds later, the ocean erupted. 2 detonations slammed into Harder's hull with such force that light fixtures shattered and cork insulation snowed from the overhead. A third explosion followed so violent that the submarine's stern lifted several feet before crashing back into the water column. When Harder crept back up to periscope depth, Minazuki was gone, completely gone. In her place drifted only black smoke, wreckage, and an expanding slick of oil spreading across the sea. But there was no time for celebration. Far on the horizon, Hayanami and Tanakaze were reacting exactly how Dealey hoped they wouldn't, but exactly how he predicted they would. They weren't regrouping. They weren't launching a coordinated attack. They were running, dropping depth charges behind them at random. The 2 destroyers fled the area in panic, convinced they had sailed into an entire wolf pack of American submarines. They had no idea the threat came from a single boat and a commander who refused to play by the rules. Dealey let them go. 1 hunter was down, 2 had broken and fled. But Japan would not misunderstand the situation for long. When the report of Minazuki's destruction reached Admiral Toyoda at 0900, the reaction on board his flagship was immediate and furious. Another destroyer gone, and not to air attack, not to mines, but to the same rogue submarine that had already humiliated them once before. Toyoda's anger turned into action. He ordered 6 more destroyers into the hunt. Patrol planes began sweeping the skies every 20 minutes. Tawi-Tawi, the heart of Japan's assembled carrier force, went into full alert. But Harder wasn't done, not by a long shot. While the Japanese searched frantically for the submarine they believed was part of a larger coordinated attack, Dealey was already planning his next strike. The men aboard Harder were exhausted, sweating in the stale, thick air of the submerged boat. Their nerves were frayed. The ocean above them was swarming with planes and destroyers. But their commander? He was reloading. The sun sank behind the horizon on June 6th, but for the crew of USS Harder, the darkness offered no comfort. The air inside the submarine had turned heavy diesel fumes, sweat, and the sharp sting of stress lingering in every compartment. Dealey had spent the entire day evading patrol planes, diving deep, listening to propellers churn above him. Japan wanted him dead, and he knew it. Shortly after midnight, on June 7th, the ocean turned pitch black. No moon, thick cloud cover, the kind of night where visibility shrank to almost nothing, and the only certainty was whatever radar revealed. At 0230, Harder surfaced to recharge her batteries. The massive diesel engines roared to life. The only sound, in an otherwise silent void. Moments later, the radar operator stiffened. Single contact, bearing 095, range 8,000 yards, closing fast. Dealey was on the bridge instantly. The target was moving at 28 knots, far too fast to be a merchant ship. It had to be a destroyer. And not just any destroyer. This was Hayanami, one of the two ships that had fled in panic from the Minazuki kill earlier that morning. Her captain, Commander Hideo Kuboki, had been searching for Harder through the night, frustrated, exhausted, and unaware that fate was dragging him back toward the submarine he had fled hours earlier. At 4,000 yards, Hayanami's radar finally picked up Harder's surface contact, a small, fast-moving blip. Kuboki likely assumed it was just a Japanese patrol boat returning to base. He was wrong. Dealey pushed Harder to flank speed, 21 knots on the surface, the submarine's diesels pounding through the night as he tried to slip inside the destroyer's detection envelope. If he could get close enough before they identified him, he could strike first. At 3,000 yards, Kuboki realized the truth. The contact wasn't friendly. It was an American submarine charging straight for him in the darkness. He ordered flank speed and a hard turn to ram. The destroyer heeled violently as it pivoted, white water exploding along her bow. But Dealey already had her. Standing exposed on Harder's open bridge, with nothing but a steel railing between him and the gale of wind rushing past, Dealey watched the destroyer's silhouette racing across the black horizon. The moment came. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. From 2,300 yards, 4 torpedoes shot out into the darkness. 2 found Hayanami's hull near the aft magazine. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic. The destroyer's entire stern ripped apart, lifted skyward before folding back into the sea. One moment her propellers were spinning. The next, they were high in the air as the ship rolled over, capsized, and vanished stern first beneath the waves. Commander Kuboki and 147 of his sailors went down with her. Dealey didn't wait to watch the sinking. Crash dive. Harder plunged beneath the surface as Dealey anticipated the next phase. Patrol aircraft. The waters around Tawi-Tawi were thick with float planes that could reach his coordinates within minutes. By dawn, Harder had chalked up 2 destroyers in less than 24 hours, right on Japan's doorstep. This wasn't a nuisance anymore. It was personal. Admiral Toyoda wasn't just angry. He was humiliated. He ordered 8 additional destroyers to break off from escort duties, ships desperately needed to protect Japan's convoys and combine into hunter-killer groups. Their singular mission, find this submarine and erase it. Harder was now the most wanted vessel in the Pacific. But Dealey wasn't done hunting. He was just measuring the distance to his next shot. By the time the sun rose on June 8th, the entire Japanese fleet at Tawi-Tawi was on edge. Destroyers were patrolling at full throttle, aircraft were combing the skies every few minutes, and every sonar operator in the anchorage was straining for the faintest echo of a submarine. Harder had turned the waters south of Tawi-Tawi into a blind spot of fear. A reasonable commander, after sinking 2 destroyers in 24 hours, would have cleared the area and headed for deeper, safer waters. But Samuel Dealey had other plans. He took Harder south into the Sabutu Passage, the narrow stretch between Tawi-Tawi and Borneo. This was a deep-water choke point funneling Japanese traffic, exactly the kind of place destroyers would be sweeping in force. Dealey went there deliberately. At 1,400 hours, the lookouts spotted smoke smearing the horizon. 2 silhouettes materialized moments later, one unmistakably the destroyer, Tanakaze, the 3rd ship from the hunting group that had chased Harder on June 6th. The vessel beside her was an escort, smaller but still dangerous. Both ships were cruising at 25 knots, executing a disciplined zigzag every 8 minutes. Dealey submerged and began the slow, meticulous work of stalking them. For 90 long minutes, Harder shadowed the destroyers, slipping ahead of their pattern, waiting out each turn, timing the rhythm of their movements down to the second. It was patience weaponized. Dealey knew that after each zigzag, there was a brief, predictable window just long enough for a submarine to aim and fire before the target corrected course. He positioned Harder dead in their path, raised the periscope, and waited as the next turn approached. At 1,630, Tanikaze began her predictable starboard swing, bringing her bow directly toward Harder. Range, 0 yards. Dealey's voice stayed level. He watched the destroyer grow larger in the periscope lens. Iki, 2 yards. Lingers, Lokstu, Ichen Wubai. By now, Tanikaze filled the entire field of view, gray steel, rising bow wave, the sense of a predator unaware it was sprinting into an ambush. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3, Fire 4. Dealey fired a wide spread with 17-second spacing between each torpedo, an insurance policy against Tanikaze's last-second course changes. The first torpedo streaked ahead of Tanikaze's bow and missed. The second struck her near the bridge. The third detonated just seconds later, slamming into the forward magazine. The explosion was so violent that Harder's crew, submerged hundreds of feet away, didn't just hear it, they felt it. The shockwave rolled through the submarine like a physical punch, rattling bones and vibrating steel. On the surface, Tanikaze's bow simply ceased to exist. The destroyer buckled, folded, and began sinking in 2 separate pieces. In under 3 minutes, she was gone. The escorting ship saw the eruption and panicked. Instead of mounting a coordinated counterattack, she charged blindly at Harder's last known position, dumping depth charges in a frenzy. Explosions thundered above Harder, but they were sloppy, too high, too scattered, too desperate to land a killing blow. Dealey took the boat to 400 feet, running silent, letting the destroyer waste her entire arsenal. After nearly 40 minutes, the escort turned away, likely fearing she would be the next target. Harder had just eliminated 3 destroyers in 3 days. News of Tanikaze's destruction hit Admiral Toyoda like a physical strike. Harder had gone from nuisance to nightmare, the devil of Tawi-Tawi, as Japanese officers were beginning to call her. And Dealey wasn't done. Not yet. June 9th was coming, and 4 more destroyers were waiting. Dawn on June 9th, 1944, broke with a thin gray light spreading over the waters southwest of Tawi-Tawi. Harder had been submerged for hours, her crew exhausted but alert, their nerves frayed from 3 straight days of combat. Yet Dealey brought the boat cautiously to periscope depth, scanning the sea for any sign of movement. What he saw made every man in the conning tower freeze. Dead ahead, cutting across the water in a perfect line abreast formation, were 4 Japanese destroyers. Not patrolling, not transiting, hunting. Their sonar pings were so loud, so insistent, that Harder's sonar operator could hear them without even wearing headphones, sharp, rhythmic blows echoing through the hull like a hammer striking steel underwater. This was no random sweep. No escort line. This was the hunter-killer group Japan had formed specifically for one target. USS Harder. Dealey checked the torpedo status. He had 8 fish left, 4 destroyers, 8 torpedoes. If he missed, all 4 would close in, forming a deadly circle. Harder would be trapped with no way out. Dealey knew he had only one chance, one shot, before the ocean turned into a coffin. He studied the formation. The destroyer on the far left was zigzagging sharply. The 3rd and 4th ships were doing the same, weaving unpredictably. Only one, the 2nd ship in line, was maintaining a steady, predictable course. That was his opening. At 0612, the 2nd destroyer made a routine turn. But this time, the turn brought her bow directly toward Harder's position, closing the gap with perfect, terrifying precision. Range, 0 yards. Dealey didn't speak. He just watched. 0 yards. The sonar pings grew faster. 2,000 wubai. The destroyer was charging straight at them, unaware she was being tracked. 2,000. The conning tower was silent except for breathing, quick, shallow, tense. At 1,800 yards, Dealey finally spoke. Fire 1, Fire 2, Fire 3. He held his 4th torpedo. He needed to save his ammunition. This attack had to be precise. 3 torpedoes shot out into the murky water, silent, electric, mark 18 seconds, threading the currents. 5 seconds apart. 5 seconds that would decide everything. All 3 torpedoes struck. Not staggered hits. Not partial damage. 3 near-simultaneous detonations ripped through the destroyer's port side. So powerful that sections of deck, gun mounts, and superstructure were hurled over 300 feet into the air. The ship didn't sink. It disintegrated. One moment it was a warship. The next, it was a boiling void of smoke, flame, and iron raining back into the sea. The other 3 destroyers saw the eruption and reacted with pure fury. They surged toward Harder's last known position as one, converging like wolves closing on a wounded deer. "Emergency deep. 500 feet," Dealey ordered. Harder plunged beneath the surface, the bow dropping as the hull groaned under the pressure. Then the ocean exploded. Depth charges hammered the water in tight, accurate patterns, 23 of them in the first 10 minutes alone. The lights went out. Red emergency lamps flickered on. A pipe burst in the forward torpedo room, spraying seawater across the deck. The hull flexed and popped, sound submariners called the bends. Yet Harder held together. For 2 relentless hours, the destroyers raked the depths with charges, turning the sea above Harder into a continuous chain of thunder. But Dealey matched them move for move, staying silent, adjusting depth, anticipating their passes. Finally, the attacks slowed, then stopped. The destroyers assumed the submarine was crushed under the sheer weight of the bombardment. But Harder survived. When Dealey cautiously brought the submarine back to periscope depth, the horizon was clear. 4 destroyers in 4 days. And Dealey wasn't counting victories. He was checking his fuel gauges. Harder had survived what should have been a death sentence, 3 destroyers pounding the ocean above her for 2 straight hours. When the submarine finally slipped back to periscope depth, Dealey wasn't celebrating. He wasn't even thinking about the 4 destroyers he had just eliminated. He was staring at the fuel gauges. Harder had burned through more than 60% of her diesel reserves. Her torpedo room held 5 torpedoes left. And the waters around Tawi-Tawi remained thick with patrols. While Dealey was weighing his remaining time on station, word of the 4th destroyer's loss reached a man whose entire strategy depended on those ships. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese mobile fleet. Ozawa did the math immediately. 4 destroyers gone in 4 days, all within striking distance of his main anchorage. From a single submarine, and that meant only one thing. Tawi-Tawi was no longer defensible. His worst fear wasn't losing the destroyers, he was losing the screen that protected his carriers and battleships. If just one American submarine had slipped inside his perimeter this easily, what would happen when the rest of the U.S. submarine force arrived? Ozawa sent a message to Toyoda so urgent it disrupted the entire command chain. The fleet must depart immediately. Remaining at Tawi-Tawi is fatal. Toyoda agreed. Operation Ago had been planned to launch on June 15th, timing the Japanese sortie to catch the American invasion fleet at its most vulnerable moment. But Harder had smashed that timeline. On June 10th at 0800, the entire Japanese mobile fleet, 4 battleships, 9 carriers, 15 cruisers, and the surviving 24 destroyers, raised anchor and fled Tawi-Tawi 6 days ahead of schedule. It was a chaotic departure. Ships left in scattered groups. Reconnaissance aircraft burned through precious fuel trying to relocate enemy forces. Destroyer formations were disorganized, many still exhausted from the frantic subhunt. Support ships lagged behind, unable to keep pace. American codebreakers at Hypo saw the shift almost immediately. The Japanese weren't moving in secrecy, they were moving in panic. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the U.S. Fifth Fleet, suddenly had something Japan hadn't intended to give him: time. 6 full days of it. With this early warning, Spruance could prepare his carriers, reposition his submarines, and set up an interception corridor that the Japanese air groups would never escape. Harder, meanwhile, knew none of this. Later that same day, June 10th at 1630, Dealey spotted yet another destroyer pair patrolling the Sabutu Passage. He still had 5 torpedoes left, enough for one more shot. At 1,715, he fired a spread of 3 torpedoes. One struck the lead destroyer in the bow, crippling her and leaving her drifting, but she didn't sink. The second destroyer, fueled by desperation or vengeance, surged toward Harder's position. Dealey fired his last 2 torpedoes. Both missed. The conning tower went silent. Harder was now out of torpedoes, low on fuel, and a destroyer was bearing down at 32 knots, intent on crushing the submarine beneath its bow. Emergency deep. Harder dove at maximum angle. 300 feet. 400. 500. Depth charges rained down for 90 minutes. 42 detonations, 3 of them close enough to shatter gauges and crack pipes. But Harder refused to die. When the submarine surfaced after sunset, the sea was empty. The destroyer had withdrawn, out of ammunition. Harder was battered, bruised, leaking, but alive. Her patrol was over. She angled her bow toward Fremantle, Australia, and limped home. She would arrive, carrying a record that remains unmatched in the entire history of submarine warfare. 5 destroyers attacked, 4 sunk, 1 crippled. 12 days. What Dealey didn't yet know was this. The chaos he triggered at Tawi-Tawi would destabilize the Japanese fleet so completely that, 9 days later, the Imperial Navy would walk into the greatest aerial massacre in naval history, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And it all began with a single submarine that refused to run. When USS Harder reached Fremantle on June 26th, her hull was scarred, her systems battered, and her crew worn thin, but the legend surrounding her had already spread across the Pacific. Admiral Charles Lockwood himself was waiting on the pier. He had followed every report, every torpedo fired, every kill confirmed. 4 destroyers sunk, 1 crippled. The most successful anti-destroyer patrol in submarine history. Lockwood awarded Dealey the Navy Cross on the spot. Then came the question every submarine skipper dreaded after a brutal patrol. Can you do it again? Dealey didn't hesitate. Give me torpedoes, he said, and I'll sink 10. For the next month, Harder's crew repaired the boat, trained replacements, and passed on the newly proven down-the-throat attack doctrine. Between June and August, inspired by Harder's success, U.S. submarines sank 14 more Japanese destroyers, using variations of Dealey's aggressive tactics. The hunters had truly become the hunted. But Japan was adapting too. On August 5th, 1944, Harder left Fremantle for her 6th war patrol. Dealey was now the senior skipper of a 3-submarine wolf pack, alongside USS Harder and USS Hake. Their mission: strike Japanese shipping west of Luzon. The opening days were a symphony of success. On August 21st, the Wolfpack sank 4 cargo ships. On August 22nd, Harder and Hado attacked coastal defense vessels, sinking 3 more. Harder was credited with 2 frigates, Matsuwa and Hiburi. But the Japanese were finally tracking their movements, and they had prepared something deadly. At 0453 on August 24th, USS Hake, submerged 4 miles away, spotted Harder on the surface through her periscope. The 2 subs were preparing a coordinated strike. Then Hake's sonar operator heard it. Echo ranging. Close. Closing fast. 2 Japanese anti-submarine escorts, CD-22 and PB-102, were bearing down on Harder at 18 knots. Japanese intelligence had intercepted the Wolfpack's radio traffic and knew exactly where they were. Hake tried to warn Dealey, but no reply came back. At 0530, Harder finally saw the escorts and crash-dived. But it was too late. She had gone under with her diesel engines still running. The massive bubble trail on the surface was a glowing arrow pointing straight to her position. CD-22's sonar operator locked onto Harder immediately. Range: Beer, Ikyu's yards. Depth: 200 feet and still diving. At 0547, CD-22 made her first attack run and dropped a perfectly set spread of depth charges. 3 detonated within 50 feet of Harder's hull. The blast cracked the aft pressure hull. Seawater tore into the stern compartments. The flooding was catastrophic, compartments filled in 90 seconds. Harder's bow shot upward as the stern dragged her down. In the control room, Dealey would have shouted for an emergency blow, but the compressed air system was fighting against the impossible weight of flooding steel. A second depth charge run hit even closer. Harder's pressure hull ruptured in multiple places. Electrical power failed. The submarine began sinking past her test depth, past her crush depth. At over 600 feet, Harder's hull finally gave way. She imploded. Instantly, 79 men, Dealey and his entire crew, were lost. No survivors. Only oil, wood splinters, and cork insulation rose to the surface. The destroyer killer was gone. Admiral Lockwood halted all operations in the area the moment Harder failed to report in. But the Japanese already knew. On August 26th, Admiral Toyoda received confirmation of the kill. The submarine that had haunted Tawi-Tawi, the Devil of Tawi-Tawi, as his destroyer officers called her, had been destroyed. Yet the damage was already irreversible. Dealey's tactics, once considered suicidal, became standard doctrine. By war's end, U.S. submarines using aggressive, down-the-throat attacks had sunk 4 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 9 cruisers, 38 destroyer, and 214 Japanese warships in total. Dealey's influence wasn't measured in medals. It was written in the wreckage of the Imperial Japanese Navy. On March 27th, 1946, President Harry Truman presented Dealey's widow, Edwina, with his Medal of Honor. Harder herself received the Presidential Unit Citation. Her motto, "Hit 'em harder," became legend. All 79 men of Harder came from different states, different backgrounds, different lives. Farmers, factory workers, college graduates. They volunteered knowing submariners suffered the highest casualty rate of any American service, 22%. The last surviving crewman, Paul Bryce, passed away in 2022 at age 98. With him, the final living voice of Harder fell silent. And that is why these stories matter. Reports tell us what they did, but only stories tell us what it felt like. The story of USS Harder does not end with her final patrol. Her legacy lives in the doctrines she reshaped, the battles she altered, and the courage her crew displayed in the most unforgiving arena of the war. In the Pacific, submariners were known as the Silent Service, but Harder's actions echoed far beyond the depths she prowled. Her victories forced the Japanese fleet out of Tawi-Tawi 6 days early, an unintended shift that unraveled their plans and helped shape the outcome of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Her tactics changed submarine warfare forever, and the men who served aboard her stood among the most determined and daring sailors the United States ever sent to sea. 79 Americans entered the ocean aboard Harder. 79 never returned. But their story did. The courage they carried into the depths still resonates today through the Medal of Honor awarded to Commander Dealey, through the Presidential Unit Citation earned by Harder herself, and through the countless submariners who adopted the aggressive tactics she pioneered. And now, with every retelling, their ship breaks the surface once more. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the pressure of the deep, the thunder of the depth charges, or the weight of the decisions these men had to make, then we ask one small thing: help keep their memory alive. A single like or comment tells the algorithm that these stories of sacrifice and courage still matter, that they deserve to be heard by more people, not forgotten in an archive. And if you want to join a community that refuses to let these pieces of history fade, we'd be honored to have you subscribe and follow our future episodes. Before you go, we'd love to know: where are you watching from? Our audience spans continents: Americans, Australians, Britons, Canadians, Filipinos, Europeans, and military families around the world. Tell us your city, your state, your country. And if someone in your family served, share their name so others can honor them too. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for helping preserve the legacy of Commander Samuel Dealey and the men of USS Harder. And above all, thank you for ensuring that their courage never disappears into silence.